Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build a ram. No, not a male sheep, or one of those gigantic oversized trucks. What I'm going to build is the 35th scale Canadian cruiser tank, Ram Mark II from Bronco models. If you'd like to see all the bits and pieces that came in the box, a while ago I did a video showing exactly that, so instead of doing that again here, if you're interested, you can go and check that out. There's a link in the description. This video is already going to be quite long without that, so strap in and feel the G's. What G's? 1G? Normal Earth gravity, I guess? The first thing to assemble is the rear plate, or if you want to use the professional technical term, the tank's butt. This is kind of an unusual place to begin, but why not? I start with this photo etch grill. By now you probably know that I'm not the biggest fan of photo etch, but parts like this aren't too bad. It pretty much just plops right into place with little to no effort required. Then I install the engine bay doors. The left one goes on first because the right door will overlap it. If you do it in the wrong order they won't close, and boy howdy will you look like a right buffoon. A small handle goes on next, and this is fiddly because it's small, but it's not really all that difficult to get into place. The end parts of the idler wheel holders, whatever you might call those, go on next, and this is just as easy as it looks, which is to say, it looks pretty easy. And then I get the superglue out again because, for some reason, plastic cement just won't bond metal. Funny that! I use it to attach the exhaust pipes to the grill part. This is made fiddly by the fact that the photo etch part has a bit of flex to it, so it will move and bend if you don't support it while applying pressure. These, I think they're air filters, can be glued together next. This is pretty simple, but don't get used to that simplicity, because this is followed with the annoying kind of photo etch that is tiny and requires multiple bends. I did finally buy a tool for bending photo etch, but that doesn't really make it any more fun, in my opinion. Anyway, this part is glued onto the side of the air filter like so. You're meant to put one of these photo etch parts on all sides of both of these, but to preserve my sanity, what little of it I have left, I've only put them on the side that will be visible. The next step is to kajigger this longer bit through the hole in the previous bit of photo etch. This is a sort of latch system to hold the box together, and it's obviously a bit fiddly, and once you get the parts in the right place it looks pretty decent. Both of these air filters can now be glued onto the rear plate, which is pretty simple. There will be a sort of shieldy thing around them, so only the inward-facing sides will be completely visible. After I test fit the shieldy things, I discovered that the lower half of the air boxes would actually be visible. What I did was to glue the long thin bits of photo etch on, without the upper part that needed bending. I'm sure this will upset somebody, but I don't see the point in modelling stuff that won't be visible, especially when it's tedious and annoying to do in the first place. Next, I install those shieldy things I mentioned before. There are nice solid guides for them, though you might still have to do a bit of nudging. You can see how the lower portion of the air filter is visible, necessitating those bits of photo etch, while the upper sections will never be visible, so might as well save about 40 minutes and not put them on. I follow this with some brackets. These aren't difficult to place, just don't try to put them on upside down, I guess. I then put shackles onto those brackets, which is fine and dandy, that is where they're meant to go, but I would suggest leaving them off until later. They're very delicate. You'll notice that sometime after the tracks are installed, my RAM no longer has these. I made the horrendous mistake of brushing a finger against them and destroyed them, so maybe save them for later. At this point I got a bit excited and thought that the whole rear was completed, but it's not. There's more photo etch. Fortunately these are just some simple parts that require a single bend before being glued into place like so, and now the whole rear is finished. It won't be much good without the rest of the hull, so I build that next. I glue the hull sides to the bottom plate, which is rather simple. There's keying, so you get things lined up nicely, at least horizontally. You will have to eyeball the vertical fit, but you shouldn't have too much trouble with it. The transmission casing goes on next. There were some bits of excess plastic on the inside of this part, which were making it impossible to position the part correctly. They weren't difficult to remove or anything, you should probably just do that before adding glue. Once that's done, the fit is nice and easy. I then add the front brackets. Nothing too tricky here, it just seemed like it might be a bit better to add these before things like the final drive casings make it ever so slightly more tricky, though it really doesn't matter when you put these on. The transmission casing should have ribs. Ribbed for her, never mind. I don't know if they really should be called ribs, but that's what I'm calling them. What matters is they're in position. Not that it was in any way difficult to put them there. Final drive casings are next, and I was impressed with the text moulded onto these. The writing should be the right way up if you were in front of the tank and tilted your head to the side, so the rest of the tank is above the numbers. That's a lot of waffle, and you could just follow the instructions. I install the hull rear next, which is also very simple. Just be careful not to damage any of the small parts that you glued on earlier. Now, running gear. First, you add the axle and arm parts to the wheel. It is kind of hard to tell by looking at the instructions, but the wheels do seem to have a particular way around they should go on the axle. The fit is a bit more wobbly if you've got it around one way than the other, so I glued them together in the less wobbly position. I did also note that either the instructions are mislabeled, or I did something wrong. I'm pretty sure the numbers for the arm and axle parts are incorrect. They do need to go together a certain way. The little plate for the upper portion of the suspension to sit on and slide around on should be facing upwards. The detail on the ends of the axles is different on either side as well. It's not hard to figure out, you've just got to pay a bit of attention and make sure you've got all of those assemblies nice and consistent. Next, I put these upper arm thingies onto the central spring part. I don't glue this yet because I still want to be able to adjust it, and the friction here is strong enough that it should stay nice and level once you get it there. Then the slightly fiddly part, putting it all together. I found gluing the spring part into place with the return roller in its position above that. Then you've got to kajigger both road wheel and arm assemblies into place, making sure they're around the right way. I then sandwich it all into place with the outer bogie part. Once everything is where it should be, I add glue to various contact points, trying to make sure it's all nice and level. It doesn't have to be perfectly level, of course, and if you're so inclined, you could model the parts at different angles to represent the tank driving over things. There is meant to be a couple of brackets on each bogie, but I figured it might be a bit easier to put those on after the bogies were glued to the hull. Now I move on to the drive sprocket. A lot of tank kits would have a polycap for the drive sprocket. This one has this ring, which I guess is meant to help the sprocket sit in the correct position. It seemed to be more effort than it was worth, and when I tested it, it looked like it would work just as well if I'd left the ring part off altogether, so that's what I did. I glued the two halves of the sprocket together, which was pretty simple. I can't actually remember if there was any keying here, but obviously I make sure the teeth are lined up so they'll engage with the track links properly. The idler wheels have a little rim that pretty much just drops right into place. Then a hubcap goes on the outer side of the wheel, which also pretty much just drops right into place. I add glue from the inside, and then figured, why not just stick it onto the hull? In the appropriate place, of course. Easy. I install the bogies next, and these are all the same, so you don't need to worry about which one goes where. As long as you have all 6 of them in the correct place, things will be just fine. Mine aren't all perfectly straight and neat, but I think they're close enough. Next, I added those little bracket things I mentioned before. There's one of these for each bogie, front and rear, and, well, they were kind of fiddly to get into place. I'm not sure if it would have been easier to do this before putting the bogies onto the hull, but I feel like either way you do it will have its own fiddliness. You can always hide any imperfections here with mud. Next, I glue the drive sprockets on. This may or may not have been a mistake. There's nothing else for the track links to engage with, so we shouldn't have too much trouble in that regard, but I think if you want to paint the tracks separately, which a lot of people prefer, you'll probably have an easier time installing them on the completed tank if you leave the drive sprockets off as well. Obviously I can't know for sure because I glued my sprockets into place, but it makes sense to me. I follow that by installing these side doohickeys. These will form the bottom of the upper hull where it hangs over the tracks. I'm sure there's a technical name for that. This central part can then go into place. I would say this isn't 100% necessary, it won't really be visible on the finished tank, but it should help ensure that the side parts we just glued on are in the correct position and give you another point of contact, and thus a bit of extra strength. I then joined the upper hull to the lower hull assembly. You'll have to kajigger it into place at the front here like so. It's not difficult, but it doesn't just drop right into place either. Once it's in the right place, I add glue to all the contact points I could find, and of course applied pressure where needed. I'm sure you will agree that it looks very hull. I built the small machine gun turret next. First, the little cylindrical mantlet-y bit goes in, and then the machine gun can be slid in through the hole there. It wouldn't be a Herbert Erpaderp video if I didn't make a mistake, so I've put the mantlet, and thus the gun, in the wrong way. Then I fixed it. The gun should be on the right side of the turret. I then installed the bottom of the turret, and discovered that it interfered with the machine gun at the elevation I wanted it to be at. So I cut the inner part of the gun down and readjusted the elevation, a simple yet effective solution. The hatch, which is made up of 2 parts, goes on next. And again, that's pretty simple. If you wanted to model this open, you could, but other than the gun, there's no interior detail, and I have destroyed the gun, so I don't really want it to be visible, and I do like the look of the closed hatches better anyway. I add a couple of little doodads on the front of the turret, and their size does make them a little bit fiddly to place, but it's nothing too difficult. And now, tracks. These are made up of multiple parts, and if you saw the What's in the Box video, you'll know that there is a lot of these multiple parts. Anyway, the bottom trackpad part goes, well, on the bottom, then the track pin parts, I guess you'd call them, go in between 2 of the track pads. Then, to hold it all together, you very carefully put a bit of glue in the center of the upper portion of the link, and then very carefully place it on top of the trackpad part. In theory, it's pretty easy to do. In practice, it's very fiddly and time-consuming, especially if you want the links to be properly workable, and for the most part, I do. It'll be pretty difficult to fit them to the tank if they're not workable, or at least mostly workable. I did make things a little bit quicker and easier for myself by gluing together the lower run of tracks as a solid section, just enough links to fit under the road wheels. If you don't want them to move, and the links touching the ground don't need to move, you don't have to be anywhere near as careful with the glue, so you can go a bit faster. There are still guide horns to add. These also require some very careful gluing and positioning. That is, if you want things to stay workable. The horns go on the end of the track pin part. After I did this, I wondered if it might have been a bit easier to glue them onto the pin parts before adding those to the links, but I didn't try it, so I have no idea. It's probably just as fiddly and time-consuming, no matter which way you do it. In fact, for those interested, I spent roughly 16 hours on the tracks in this build, and that's about an hour and a half more than the rest of the build took. Obviously, I didn't do them in one go. That way lies insanity. I built them in a bunch of short sessions while watching streams. To make it easier to get the right number, I built them in groups of 10 links, and then 2 shorter sections, which I then connected to each other to make the full runs of track. There are meant to be 84 links per side. That's right, 84. In reality though, it was a bit more than that, and I think that might have been because of the bottom run of track. There's probably some compression between some of the links that wouldn't exist if they weren't all bonded together. Test fitting should help you determine the correct number. In the end, I was pretty happy with how the tracks looked and behaved, but it was definitely not the most fun thing to do. Putting the tracks onto the tank is the obvious next step, and this, in my opinion, should be done before putting on the front guard, which means they have to go on before painting, which is a bit annoying, but I feel like painting these would probably stick the links together and stop them from being workable anyway, so I'll paint them on the tank. It's not like that's the hardest thing in the world to do. Getting the tracks into place on the tank isn't the hardest thing. It's simple enough to put them on the sprockets and get them over the wheels and such, but making the final connection was very fiddly and rather annoying, and the result is pretty messy. I spent a lot of time arsing about with it. Gluing the tracks into place along the road wheels and idler does help things. It stops them from shifting as much, but it was still really fiddly to connect things up. In the process, I knocked a bunch of guide horns out of place and damaged the shackles on the rear of the hull. You can see here where the links join, and it is definitely not pretty. It might have been a better idea to try and make the connection point under a road wheel or something. I didn't think of that until after it was done though, so maybe next time. Usually I don't have a problem with individual links, but these were particularly annoying to do, mostly because there's so many parts with which you have to be very careful when gluing. Also, the result is pretty fragile, but they're on the tank now, so it's time to move on. Here's the front guard thing I mentioned. It's pretty simple to install this. The instructions do say to glue the two guards and the pole thing that runs between them together and then install that on the hull, but I figured it would be a bit easier to do it the way that I did it. You can see what I meant when I said this part would interfere with installing the tracks. You could still get them into place, especially if you didn't glue the sprocket on. It would just be kind of difficult and annoying. But again, painting the tracks in place on a 35th scale tank isn't really all that hard, so I'm not really worried about it. Next, I put this vision device together. The clear part did need a bit of trimming to fit into the protective collar, but nothing too difficult. That can be installed here, in this hole over the driver's area. Next, this little doohickey goes here. This is part of the stand, I guess you'd call it, that holds the hatch open. If you choose to model it open, you would also add that vertical part. I am modelling it closed though, as you can see here. Plopping the hatch into place is rather easy. Above the hatch there should be two little hinge parts. If you were watching the live stream, you'll know that Careful Herbert lost one of those very tiny parts by accidentally brushing it away. Did he find the part? Stay tuned to find out. In the meantime, I add these little grab handles, which are presumably to help the crew swing into those side hatches. There are some small indents, which are quite helpful for getting the positioning of these, though I did guess at the correct angle a little bit. Looking at the painting guide suggests they have a slight outward lean. I then add these little hatches, which go over the fuel and I assume other liquid filling points. The first one of these went on pretty easily, but the rest required some convincing. Fortunately, there are 6 of these, so if you do lose one, there's a spare. Next, I install the side hatches. They pretty much drop right into place. There is a photo etch bulge, I don't know, that would go over the vision slot thing on the side of the door. That is an optional part though, so I've left it off. Mainly because I like the way the hatch looks without it, but also because I didn't want to do the bending for the photo etch part that I didn't like the look of as much. There are also some photo etch latches for these, which I was going to put on, but I broke both of them while trying to bend them, which was pretty annoying. It is worth noting though, for the bending points on those latch parts, there were only 2 etched bending points, and both parts needed 4 bends. I was kind of surprised they broke, but I guess it makes sense, because the etched area where you're meant to bend the parts is thinner and therefore weaker, so when you're trying to bend the thicker part, you have a chance to break the thin part. I guess I'm going to have to contrive some sort of cover-up, like a tarp or a cleaning rag or something. Or maybe even mud. I did contact Bronco about obtaining replacement parts, but as yet I haven't heard anything back. Anyway, back to adding detail-y bits. There's a pair of fire extinguishers on either side of the hull, just behind the grab handle bit. There is a couple of guides for these too, though you'll probably have to eyeball them a bit to make sure they're on properly. On the engine deck, I add some tools, like this engine starting crank, and an axe, just in case questions need to be axed. There are various guides and mounting holes for these tools, and there was also a little bit of guesswork in getting them positioned, but not too much. I mean, the instructions do show you where they go, it's just most of them don't have any mounting pins, just slightly raised guides on the hull. I think I've got them in pretty much all the right places though, or close enough anyway. I assemble the headlamps next and we get some choices here. We can have covered lights, or clear plastic lenses. I chose covered because I think they look more interesting, and they're also a bit easier to paint without having to leave bits off, though it is mainly the appearance that's guiding my choice here. I think they look quite nice, and I really appreciate the fine detail here with the thin brackets holding the lamps all in one piece. I'm really happy this wasn't photo etch. The thin plastic does obviously make them easy to break, so do be careful when installing them. There are no mounts for these, so you've got to eyeball the positioning. They pretty much go where the final drive casing meets the transmission. The instructions suggest adding these and their photo etch brush guards much earlier, but I figured they would be really easy to break, so I left them off until now, and the brush guards are staying off until even later. I did add some more photo etch at this point though, this grill. It just drops into place and shouldn't be too challenging. And then this thing, whatever it is. It did need bending, but the bending points are etched, so it's just a matter of getting the correct angles and gluing it into place. I then add this little thing, which I believe is a hook that holds the towing cable in place. I don't know if there should have been a mounting hole for this, but there wasn't. I just guessed at the correct positioning. It's probably close enough. Next, I add some more stowage boxes at the front here. These are presumably for storing maple syrup. That's what Canadian tanks have in them, right? Maple syrup and probably some poutine. Poutine. These are optional parts, but I thought they looked interesting, so I've added them. I didn't film it, but I added this little pole here, and it was pretty simple. Before I do anything else with it, I add these tiny little lights on either side of the mudguard. They are obviously very fiddly because they're very small, and they're rounded, so putting them in tweezers is a bit of a flight risk. But I did manage to get them both into place without losing them, and that was almost a surprise. Then I add this mirror. It was a little bit fiddly to get onto the mounting pole without breaking said pole, but I was able to do that too. Miraculous. I'm not sure how well adjusted it is, but if the driver has a problem with it, he can fix it himself. I then add this piece of photo etch on the hull rear. I figured the best way to do this was glue one side on, make sure it was sitting as flat against the hull as I could get it, and then glue the other side down, and that seemed to work pretty well. It'll probably surprise you to learn that I have no idea what this is. It kind of looks like a stowage box with no ends. It's probably not that, maybe it's a kind of stowage rack. At any rate, as far as photo etch goes, this isn't anything to complain about, though I did leave one off until much later because I just couldn't be bothered. Let's move on to the turret. First, I glue these little doovers onto the ends of the inner mantlet part. Then, to make sure they're aligned properly with how I want my gun elevation to be, I use the outer mantlet part to make sure things are lined up nice and straight. The opening in the front of the turret had a fair bit of flash and needed a lot of cleanup, and the outer mantlet part was nice and neat, so it made more sense to use that to get things straight. After a bit of cleanup, I glue the inner mantlet part into place on the turret. It made sense to follow that with the outer mantlet part. This will kind of force everything to be squished into place. It did kind of look like this part was sitting a bit weirdly on the turret, especially at the bottom, but it seems like that's the way it's meant to be. Next, I glue the coaxial machine gun into place. I like that this had a long collar sort of thing, I guess you'd call it, around the opening. It gives the gun a lot of support and ensures that it's lined up nice and straight. I then insert a vision device, which is exactly the same as the one I put into the hull earlier, into the forward half of the commander's hatch, which I then, unsurprisingly, installed in the commander's cupola. This is a bit fiddly because there isn't much to glue the hatch parts onto, so you do have to do a bit of nudging and eyeballing. I assume it's done this way so that it looks a bit more convincing when the hatch is modelled open, which I haven't done. Then this, I assume, ventilation cover goes here, nice and easy. Then I attach these little side hatch pistol port things, and obviously I'm modelling them closed, though you could just as easily have them open. And now, another piece of photo etch that doesn't really need to be photo etch. I'm kind of surprised I managed to get this into place fairly neatly, and not at some weird angle. This really could have been moulded into one of the hatch halves, and it would have looked perfectly fine. Instead of complaining too much, I glue the bottom of the turret into place, which is pretty easy. It does have a bit of a lip around it, which doesn't quite look right to me, but it seems like the real thing had an obvious seam there, so it's okay, though it could do with a bit of sanding to make it a bit less obvious. And now, something that confused me a bit. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? There's a stowage bin and a plate sort of thing. I've seen pictures of rams with nothing on the back of the turret, but apparently both of these parts should go on at the same time. In fact, the instructions seem to want you to stick them together before installing them. I did it the opposite way, and it looks kind of weird, but that's what I've got. Just in front of that, I add this little antenna mount. Then, another antenna mount a bit further forward and to the right. Then, because it looks kind of weird without it, I attach the main gun barrel. This is pretty simple. There's no muzzle brake, so it doesn't really matter which way it goes on, as long as it isn't backwards and is relatively straight. Then, I attach the turret to the hull. The model is not complete yet, but I was demonstrating this on stream, and this is a better shot of the locking tab mechanism than what I got later. And I know some of you sickos are going to want to see that. Now I add various bits of detail, mostly photo etch, that I skipped over during the build. Oh yeah, I also found the other hinge part for this little hatch. Turns out it bounced into the end of an empty insulin cartridge. What are the odds? This is really silly, but I'm pleased the carpet monster didn't eat it. Anyway, I installed the brush guards for the main headlamps, and would you be surprised to learn that I didn't have the best of times doing this. Fortunately, the bending points are all etched into the parts, which does make them a lot easier to get close to the right shape, and I haven't shown the bending here, but I did bend them. You can tell by how they are. Getting them onto the tank without damaging them was the real pain in the ass here. I do appreciate that the main brush guard part and the brackety bit behind it are separate parts, because it would have been even more of a pain to bend everything if it was all in one. It does make installation a bit more tricky though, having to get everything lined up neatly. It does look pretty rough, but I got them on in the right place and looking relatively okay. Let's just say a little bit of damage happened in battle, or, as the kids say, battle damage. Then I added these absurdly thin brush guards for the side lamps. The bending with these isn't too bad, but they're so small and light that it was almost impossible to handle them without bending them further. I did get them on though, and I only cried a little bit. I'm expecting these parts to vanish next time there's even a hint of a slight breeze. Then there's a couple of little things, and there are indents to guide these, which was pretty helpful. I'm pretty sure they're mounts for the straps that would go around the towing cables. Those straps are also photo etch, but I decided against putting them on because it seemed like much more of a pain in the ass than it would be worth. There's no way these mounts are going to hold onto the photo etch straps and the towing cable and stay in place. Especially not when I have to exert force on them to bend the straps around the towing cable. Say what you will, but to me it really didn't seem worth the frustration. There are also meant to be 2 more of these mounts behind the stowage box, but I couldn't find the mounting indents for them, so I didn't bother. To finish the hull, I glued the little machine gun turret into place. I've got it facing slightly to the left, just for flavour, I guess. Maybe there's a very naughty person standing over there. Maybe it's the towing cable thief. Anyway, that's the Canadian cruiser tank, Ram Mark II, in 35th scale from Bronco models, completed. I think it's a pretty good model, and it is certainly a very interesting subject. I mean, it's not that weird looking a tank, but it is a bit unusual. It's obvious that I'm no ramologist, so I can't tell you if the details are 100% correct or not, or if some bolt isn't the right size or whatever, but it looks quite convincing to me, and the details are nice and crisp. Clearly a couple of them are missing, the towing cable and associated doodadery being the main one, but as I just said, I didn't see it as being worth the frustration of trying to get those parts on. If you really need those towing cables to be in place with their little tie-down straps, you can add them when you build the kit. I'm not going to stop you. The handles for the side hatches are also unfortunately missing, and I did send that email to Bronco to see if getting spare parts is a thing, but so far there's been no response. To be honest, I'm not really expecting a response, so I guess I'm going to have to contrive something to cover that up. I do still have the larger portion of the broken parts, so maybe that's a start. On a more positive note, I'm really glad that I found the hinge part for the front hatch. I talked about it on stream, and the idea that I came up with was to cover it with a rag, perhaps modelling the Ram mid-servicing or something like that. You can always come up with a story for anything really, and sometimes that is part of the fun of building a model. Okay, so I might have done a fair bit of complaining about the photo etch in this kit, but it's not like any of it was a surprise. I don't go into these things blind, and if I really didn't want to do it, I would never have built the kit. The way I see it, it's not a bad thing to step out of your comfort zone from time to time. My comfort zone being whatever the opposite of the photo etch zone is. Anyway, I did have a good time building this, and definitely a long time, particularly when it came to the tracks. But most of it was a good time, and if you don't mind the photo etch, or the tracks, or you can find a set of the appropriate Friel tracks, I would recommend this kit. It's definitely not a quick afternoon project, but if you're patient, it is a good one, and I think the result is quite nice. I will certainly be doing more Bronco kits in the future, though not right away. I think I'll avoid kits that have photo etch for a little while. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. If you want to watch me building kits like this one live, check out my Twitch channel, where I livestream pretty much every build you see on this YouTube channel. There's a link in the description. Subscribe if you want, support on Patreon or Ko-fi if you're able to, and check out the links in the description below. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.